This is Pete Thamel in New Orleans for the Yahoo College Sports Podcast. We have a very special interview today. The first person outside the world of sports to appear on the vaunted and esteemed Yahoo College Sports Cast. We are welcoming Brett Anderson, the food critic and features writer for the Times-Picayune, the esteemed New Orleans newspaper, and NOLA.com. Brett also contributes to the New York Times, the NewYorker.com, Travel and Leisure. He's a two-time James Beard Award winner. Should have been 3 times. He was robbed because of his great reporting that led to some significant changes here in New Orleans. We can get into that in a little bit. He is the owner, as you will hear, of the greatest laugh in America. Pat Forty pointed that out. And he just laughed on cue. He's America's unique laugh champ, and we will appreciate him for that. He was a Neiman Fellow at Harvard a few years back. Joined me in Boston for a few good restaurant escapades when he was up there, and is now, as we sit here in Hotel Peter and Paul, he is the husband of a hotelier in New Orleans. Hotel Peter and Paul opened when, Brett?
Like 3 days ago.
Okay, so at some point in mid-October, an awesome concept. We're in the Metairie district. Marigny. I'm sorry. Faubert Marigny. We are sitting right now in the Catholic school, which is one of 4 buildings of the Hotel Peter and Paul. There's also a church, rectory, which will eventually be a bar, which is great. There's a convent, and overall there are 71 different rooms here in the Marigny.
That is correct.
Not the Metairie. Brett, thanks for joining the Yahoo College Podcast. We're going to start today by talking a little bit about how does one become a food critic. So we appreciate you having us, and I imagine you didn't have like a sophisticated palate at age 7, and that has led you to this. Journey. So obviously, you have you're considered the best food writer in America. You're in the best food city in America. Yes, I know you didn't say that, but I did. It's our podcast. Walk us through how you got to this point to have one of the coolest jobs in all of the country.
Well, my short answer about how I became a food critic is by accident. And in fact, not only did I not have a sophisticated palate at age 7, I did not have a sophisticated palate when I got my first job as a food critic. I started out as a music writer, rock and roll writer, in Minneapolis, which is where I grew up. I worked at a weekly newspaper there back in a million years ago now, but the early 90s. I was still in college. And the editor that hired me there was this guy who had just gotten out of drug rehab, and but turned out to be a really good journalist. His name is David Carr. He went on to work at the New York Times and so forth, and he sadly passed a few years ago. But it was his idea. He had taken a job in Washington D.C. to edit a weekly paper there called the City Paper back around '95, and I had worked for him in Minneapolis, and he invited me to come out and work at the City Paper. And it was his idea that one of the jobs that I would do out there would be to write a weekly column called Young and Hungry. And the reasons he asked me had nothing to do with my sophisticated palate and everything to do with my gigantic appetite.
Young and Hungry does sound like a punk band too. So.
Yeah, that was his name. The column actually still exists at City Paper, but I kind of got it into it backwards. And when I wrote that column, it was a little bit less than half my job, really. I mean, I was writing feature stories and music stories and things like that as well. And I always thought that I would transition out of writing for food into being kind of a, writing for Esquire magazine or whatever you think you're going to do when you're 22 years old. And I just ended up it became kind of more my professional identity. I never got sick of it. In fact, I really learned to I became like a snobby gourmand. And back in 2000, I got a call from an editor here at the Times-Picayune asking if I would be interested in interviewing for this job, and here I am. I've been here all these years.
So being in the sports world, we love extremes. What is the worst restaurant you have ever reviewed? And I remember the famous Pete Wells Guy Fieri review. I don't know if you ever had anything quite like that. That was in the New York Times a couple years ago, and it was just like an evisceration of the guy's soul. What is the worst restaurant you have ever had the pleasure of reviewing? And like, at what point do you feel bad panning someone?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I've never had a Guy Fieri sort of viral review. We haven't been so lucky as to have such a big target here that was that bad. I tend to really rip, spend 800 to 1,300 words eviscerating a restaurant. I feel there needs to be a reason, a compelling reason. I would say, I think probably the review I've written since I've been in New Orleans that was very negative, that got the most sort of pushback and feedback was over 10 years ago now. I wrote a review of the restaurant Brennan's, which is one of the legendary restaurants in New Orleans, really historically important in terms of the development of the city as like a culinary center, and owned by a branch of a very famous restaurant family. And that restaurant had really become, just the embodiment of a tourist trap, and I thought very much did not live up to its reputation. And I went there a series of times. It was very expensive, and I thought failed on a variety of different levels. And so I wrote an incredibly harsh review of it. And I just recall getting lots of, angry phone calls from sort of important people in town, and that's part of the job. It has since become, it was purchased out of bankruptcy by another member of that family, and revived to the tune of very many millions of dollars, and is today I consider to be one of the best restaurants in New Orleans, to be clear. But back in the day, that was one of the ones that sort of, in the pre-social media era would have counted as a viral pan.
Do you think they changed because of what you wrote?
No. No. I don't.
I would think sometimes like a review like that ends up being a reality check, and I wonder if anyone has ever come back and thanked you for, hey, you pointed out some flaws and maybe made us a little better and got us back on our game.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, I do believe that if I'm going to write a review, even if it's negative, there needs to be something to recommend the place. That, like in this market, given it, that's my standard generally. And I do occasionally get people who say, hey, thanks for pointing that out. But not a lot. Not a lot.
So our goal for this podcast, having Brett on the Yahoo College Sports Podcast, is that Louisiana, Baton Rouge specifically, but mostly New Orleans we're going to focus on because that's where people usually come in for LSU games and drive over, is going to become a little bit of the center of the college football universe. Specifically November 3rd, LSU hosts Alabama, and that will be a likely clash of at least top 10 type teams. This will be Alabama's biggest test of this season. It will be every college football season has the game, and this is at least building up to be that game, which means there's going to be a ton of Alabama fans, LSU fans pouring in from out of town. It's in New Orleans. There's going to be a ton of national media, and there's just going to be a ton of people who like a good party, and there's always a good party around a good LSU-Alabama game, even if it ends 9-6. So, to start, though, as we verge into sports and food here, Brett is a Minnesotan, and we need to ask him what he thinks of the P.J. Fleck era so far. He is a Gopher grad, correct?
I am a University of Minnesota grad. In fact, I just came back from Minnesota. I was there 2 weeks ago. It was Gopher homecoming. I was there for my high school reunion. A good chunk of my buddies went to the game, the homecoming game. I believe they played Iowa. I did not get into town early enough for that. I have a complicated relationship with Gopher sports. I grew up, my father was a hockey player, and he played for the Gophers, which is particularly in his era, was, that was the best hockey team in the country. And so we grew up going to those games, to the hockey games. We also grew up going to the football games. My father was a politician, and that you know, you go to the football games. Like, we always liked football, but I have to say, I have grown weary in my old age of, you know, getting excited for the Indiana victory. You know, I mean, like, it's like, can we get past that? Can we get past that as a success, beating Indiana or Purdue? So I'm sort of cynical. That said.
So you didn't row the boat after?
No, but that said, I think that the stadium on campus is awesome. The outdoor stadium is a great improvement. I like PJ Fleck's enthusiasm. I wish him all the best. And, but you know, my taste for college football got perverted when I moved to the SEC, and you know, and it becomes harder to root for the Gophers when I live in a community where they, you know, won 2 national championships at the Sugar Bowl, which is like, you know, in the Sugar Bowl 10 blocks from where I live. I've gotten caught up in that. I mean, I'm a loyal Big Ten guy, but and I wish PJ Fleck the best, but I'd like to see the win-loss. You know, let's beat Michigan or Ohio State sometime. Please. That's what I feel about it.
Calling your dad a hockey player and a politician would be a little bit like calling Barack Obama a lawyer. But I will. I appreciate the humility, and will bring up your complicated relationship with the NHL, which you swore off after the North Stars left Minnesota. I don't actually remember what year that was because it was so long ago.
I believe it was 1993. And you should know, I mean, I don't know, this is not a hockey podcast. In fact, we're supposed to be talking about food, but
we'll get there.
You know, Minnesota, for those who don't know, it's, you know, hockey means a lot to people in Minnesota. There's 11 Americans, not including the coach on the 1980 Olympic team that won the gold medal. 11 Minnesotans. And, you know, when I grew up, and this is true of a lot of my friends, the ethic of hockey and you know, going out and playing outside in the cold and not bitching about it and all that sort of stuff was part of what made you a person. And I grew up loving the North Stars, and I would, to the point where I knew how to copy. I had the signatures, the autographs of everyone on the team, and I could reproduce the signature of like Steve Payne and Al McAdam and Donnie Beaupre and all these. Dino Ciccarelli was my favorite. Like, to make it look, I could write their signatures just like they did. And you know, the NHL let the team from Minnesota go to Dallas, and I have not watched a second of NHL hockey since then. It boggles my mind why others haven't followed me in this boycott. It's inexcusable for a league to let a team go to Dallas from Minnesota.
America, you've been put on notice for your low ethics. Well, let's transition to a little bit of food here, because I think most people here tuned in because they want to know where to eat in New Orleans and where to drink in New Orleans, and what neighborhoods to explore, and how to go around. Let's start with this neighborhood where we're sitting here at Hotel Peter and Paul. This is sort of an interesting neighborhood to me because of its history and recent transition. Why don't we start here, and then we'll go to sort of, obviously you do a lot of the best lists, and we'll tweet some of those out for my followers so they can see it, you know, the new restaurants, the hot chefs. Brett and I have a similar job. I have to write like the hot Mac coaches who are going to get hired. He has to write like the hot chefs from the different restaurants that are rising. It's sort of our journalistic common ground. But let's start here in what's around here in this neighborhood where Hotel Peter and Paul is, and then move out to the greater city.
Sure. Well, just to tell your listeners, a little bit about the Marigny, the neighborhood that we're in. It's the neighborhood that's just downriver from the French Quarter. This is actually where I've lived all 18 years that I've been in New Orleans. And in the last 7-8 years, it's actually gone through quite a few drastic changes. It's gentrified a lot. It's often lumped together with the neighborhood that's adjacent to us, Bywater, Marigny and Bywater, and there's been a lot of activity in terms of new restaurant openings and bar openings down here, and there's also, you know, a lot of legacy businesses that have always, you know, sort of defined the character of these neighborhoods. You know, Frenchmen Street is a big place where people go out. I mean, it's sort of almost like an alternative to Bourbon Street, but don't think of it. The crowds can be that much, but it is not it's not a strip club strip.
No beads.
No, it's a music street and live music street, and it's still a really great place to go see live New Orleans music at clubs like DBA. Snug Harbor is the old jazz club here if you're into traditional jazz, and the Spotted Cat, places like this. There's also a great old Italian Creole. They call it Creole Italian here in New Orleans, which is basically red sauce Italian as you know it, but with a lot of Gulf seafood in it. And it also is a fantastic old sort of bohemian Marigny holdout that does really good red sauce Creole Italian cooking. In terms of sort of newer places in this neighborhood, there's a place called Paladar 511 that I really like, which is what we think of as more of a modern Italian restaurant, even though they're using, inspired by, ancient cuisine. I mean, not ancient, but the way they've been cooked for hundreds of years, but in a different style that we're used to seeing in New Orleans. And I think that's a great place. It's built inside an old warehouse that, of course, has condominiums on top of it, and like a lot of places around here. But I really highly recommend it. And there's also Bywater American Bistro is owned by a woman, a chef, Nina Compton, or co-owned by her and her husband Larry, and she's one of the better real sort of shining stars here in New Orleans who's emerged in the last 4 or 5 years. She's a woman that was born and raised in St. Lucia in the Caribbean and really kind of cooks through that prism. And Compère Le Pain, which is her flagship restaurant, is absolutely one of the best in New Orleans in my estimation. Bywater American Bistro is her second restaurant. It's within 5 blocks from where we are right now. Bacchanal is also a place I highly recommend to people. It's a place that's built inside an old, well, not an old, but an old building, a very old building that 18 years ago was turned into a wine store back when it was hard to imagine anyone buying at least pedigreed wine in that area. And that has now over time evolved into a restaurant as well. And it's a great place to go see live music. They have live jazz there outside, sitting on a back patio. It's a very idiosyncratic place. You order at a window and then the food comes to you at what are generally plastic tables. But I think if you've ever been there or if you go there, you'll understand that it's something special. The last place I'd mention in this neighborhood that I think that your listeners would be interested in is called N7, which is the letter N, the letter 7, or the number 7, and it's a bar and cafe that's sort of built where there was, I believe, an old auto repair shop or a tire shop. And if you take an Uber or a cab there, when you pull up to the address, you're going to look around and wonder where it is. It's behind this gate, and you walk back, and it's this idyllic French restaurant with great natural wines and cocktails, and it's a great place to sit outside, particularly this time of year in New Orleans. It's very nice outside, and drink wine and get a little snack.
All right. Well, I'm going to throw in my little 2 cents here. Obviously, I'm like the peasant, and Brett is the expert here. I have been to Bacchanal, and I just think it's fantastic. There's been a couple times when either Final Fours or Sugar Bowls or national title games have been in New Orleans, and I found it a great place to go with a group. You sit outside, especially because the weather's going to be in November, probably still pretty nice here, and just a it's like an experience almost more than a restaurant. And I would say this about Frenchmen Street I've probably been in New Orleans 25 times now over the course of my life. If you don't want that crazy Bourbon Street, just total assault on the senses, but you want to go have a good time and see live music and get a sense of the cultural, I think that's the perfect and easy alternative for
multiple places in one. You don't have to get in a cab every time you want to get a different vibe, right? You walk next door, you can walk across the street. So there's that there's that density of clubs down there, and it's a music focused street. When I moved to New Orleans in 2000, there was nothing, hardly anything. I mean, it's not right to say there was nothing down there, but it was not what it is right now. And it is kind of a modern phenomenon by the standards of New Orleans, calling it modern, in which that has sort of taken off as a destination for visitors. And I think it's a great thing. I mean, I've some of the best live music I've ever seen has been around there.
My first trip to New Orleans was 1997. I was a sophomore at Syracuse, clearly well-adjusted and ready for this trip. Syracuse played at Tulane in football, a highly unmemorable contest, I can assure you. Tabucky Jones returned an interception for a touchdown to seal the game. Yes. And I just, like... It would never have, again, the prism of my 19-year-old mind, God bless it, I would never have occurred to me to do anything but go to Bourbon Street. It was like a laser arrow focus. And then, after a decade of coming there, now it would never even occur to me to go to Bourbon Street, like in that prism. And I think a little bit of, in what we're going to walk through here, I say there's an introduction to, Brett's going to walk us through, like, if you're the college crowd, if you're sort of the post-college, bro-ish 20s crowd, and then if you're of the booster set, if you will, to keep it collegiate, like, what are the white tablecloth, like, great all-time restaurants? Like, if you're listening to this heading into the game, where do you need to make a reservation this weekend and go have, like, a good high-end experience? So,
since we were just talking about Frenchmen Street, can I suggest we do let's talk about the kind of when the younger kids are here, because we're way downtown, basically, right? Literally where we're sitting, but also where we've been talking, the area we've been talking about. Way on the opposite side of town, near the river bend, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's where the Mississippi River bends, and it's sort of closer up to Tulane and so forth. The Ferret Street corridor is a street that has been revived. Or it's been transformed, I should say, in the last 8-9 years. Has music clubs up there, also some restaurants that if you're on a budget or just like not in the mood for something super fancy, you're not wanting to break the bank, there's a wonderful kind of neighborhood New Orleans restaurant up there called the Hi Hat Cafe, which has really good cocktails, great like fried catfish and po' boys and other sort of fried chicken and things like that, but that is really well prepared, not super expensive. You can stay on that street and go out to other bars. Cure is a cocktail bar up there it's a fancy cocktail bar. It's, very influential in New Orleans in that regard, but also just a great place to go drinking. Company Burger, one of the best hamburgers, I think, in the country. It's basically a fast food place, but you can go in there and get a good beer.
Better than Port of Call.
I'm pretty loyal to Port of Call. It's a different kind of hamburger, let's put it that way. And so there's a big collection of places up there that I recommend. Then there's also, if you move a little bit closer to the river, Giacomos, I know, is a favorite among a lot of my friends and among my visiting sports writing fans,
including me.
Which is sort of it's one of these places that, to me, it feels like you're eating in sort of an urban juke joint or something. I mean, it really satisfies this I think a fantasy a lot of people have for New Orleans as being a town where you can kind of walk into any building and be confronted with this like incredibly flavorful food. Giacomos is a place that's like, they have absolutely fantastic there's a couple dishes there that I think are great. The black and red fish, which is a classic New Orleans dish. They do have a wonderful version of it there. I think their fried chicken is excellent. And it's a really fun place to hang out. And it's next door to the Maple Leaf, which is one of the, really great New Orleans clubs. It features sort of rhythm and blues, funk, local New Orleans music. Tuesday nights, the Rebirth Brass Band has basically a residency dating back to the dinosaurs, and it's just if one of the most memorable fun nights you can have in New Orleans, if you're in the mood to sort of stay out late and see what it's like to be out late in New Orleans, is have a long leisurely dinner at Giacomos and trip over next door to the Maple Leaf.
So I'm going to tell my Giacomos story. First of all, the first time I went there was 2003 when the Final Four was here. Syracuse beat Kansas for the national title. I was a stringer for the New York Times at the time, and Jack is from upstate New York, who runs Giacomos. So he's a huge Syracuse fan, and he found out that I had gone to school there and probably that I was writing for the Times, to be honest, and all of a sudden, all these bottles of wine. magically appeared at my table. But he did tell a cool story that R.W. Apple, the great political correspondent for years and a well-known foodie, was a regular there and a friend to his, which I thought was kind of neat. Much better story than that is I was covering the BCS meetings, which were just drudgery as they were screwing up college football year after year in the 2000s, and all the executives would get together and decide how they screwed up last year and how they were going to like screw up worse the next year. And so you kind of had to like sit outside the hotel room, but there would be all these like bowl people there and such. So I got a group together to go to Giacomos one night, and it was one of those deals, you know, they're like, hey, we're going to have a table for 6. Oh no, it's going to be 8. So I called 2 or 3 times, and the girl at the desk like got annoyed with me after a while. So we had a little back and forth going, and so anyway, we go, we eat and everything, and I leave, and she grabs my shirt when I leave, and she's like, Pete, you need to stay. And I was a little bit like, huh? She's like, trust me, go get a beer. You need to stay. So I was with my friend Matt Livicari, who's a lawyer in town here, and I was like, all right, let's get a beer. So we get a beer. In like it was probably the spring. Those meetings were always in the spring. It was right before Jazz Fest. Robert Plant walks in the door of Giacomos, and like right on cue, he has like straight from Almost Famous, like 23-year-old blonde girls, like one on each arm. And I was like, oh, okay, those stereotypes are true. And the girl at the front desk kind of winked at me, and I was like, thank you, I appreciate that. My little New Orleans moment. So if it's good enough for Robert Plant and his company, it's probably good enough for that. So I have a friend in town here who doesn't think Giacomos is that great. So Tulane coach Willie Fritz, also a big fan of Giacomos. I said this on our Race for the Case podcast the other day. He and I once had a watermelon mojito there together, and neither of us are particularly ashamed about it. A lot of guys who run the Veer offense don't tend to drink watermelon mojitos. Willie got the fried chicken. He's a Midwestern Kansas guy. So we are going to. What subset of visiting folks, Brett, would you like to start with here? Do you want to start with the white tablecloth, pinkies out booster crowd, or do you want to start with the Bama Bangs kind of early 20s, student section-ish crowd?
Let's kind of go up the price scale like we've been talking about. I mean, you still need to bring your wallet for any of this stuff, but I think in terms of a younger crowd, but also frankly, don't plug your ears if you're over 35. Restaurants that I'd like to throw out that we haven't talked to about. One is called Mofo, which is spelled Mopho. The pho there refers to the Vietnamese soup. And this is a restaurant. This is another place that I'd recommend for lunch or like a more casual dinner.
There's probably not great pho in Tuscaloosa, I'm thinking.
Maybe not. I don't know. Vietnamese food in New Orleans is it's one of our better represented new immigrant cuisine here, right? Although it's not even all that new anymore. I mean, the population of Vietnamese people here really swelled in the 70s in the wake of the war or during it. And Michael Galata is a local guy. He's a white guy, but he grew up here. He'd worked in the white tablecloth restaurants here in New Orleans and opened Mofo like, I don't know, 5 years ago now, I think. But it's a po' boy shop and noodle shop really, and that sort of explores the food of the Mekong Delta and the Mississippi Delta. That's the way that they sort of talk about it. But it's and kind of runs with that with its specials. It has some of the best, absolute most delicious fried chicken wings in New Orleans. They're very Vietnamese style with that sort of sticky sweet sauce. They're spicy, but also wonderful noodle soups and po' boys with ingredients you don't see every day. A lot of them riffing off what is banh mi is what they call. It's what they call Vietnamese po' boy. But that's a place that's worth taking a taxi to or whatever. It's not in the French Quarter. Cochon is a very good standby. It's incredibly fun, mainly Cajun restaurant run by a chef restaurateur named Donald Link and his partner Steven Strajewski. They're absolutely some of the best restaurateurs in town. And that is just one of the more consistently excellent restaurants that serves food that is not exactly what you're going to find outside New Orleans. I mean, it's sort of pork centric, as the name might suggest, but it is it's been one of the better, more solid New Orleans restaurants it opened the year after Hurricane Katrina in 2006, but of the last decade, and is also fun for a group. It's a place you don't have to watch your P's and Q's. It's not outlandishly expensive. It's this is not fast food either. But I think younger people would particularly like it. Two places I'm going to mention before going to the pinky raised. Place called Luvi, L-U-V-I, little spot way up on Tchoupitoulas, near Tipitina's, which is another great music club, is a restaurant that just opened this year by a man who had been working in sushi restaurants here for many years. And it's sort of like, the way I would describe it, it's a small, intimate, really welcoming place that does... It's sort of like if someone took a sushi menu and just pulled out the best things and a couple originals. It's a great place if you like raw fish and that kind of stuff, and has some really interesting cocktails that play on the flavors that you really kind of associate with, particularly with Japanese food. And then there's Echo's Pizzeria, which is a mid-city restaurant. Is a really fun place to hang out. It's wood burning oven pizzas. It's sort of that price scale, that also does really good kind of seasonal side dishes, and arancini, which is a big fried rice ball that's sort of a
ball of goodness.
Yeah, they have wonderful stuff, and that's a good place to go for lunch or dinner or with a group. They've got a great back patio, and you really will feel what it's like to eat in a neighborhood in New Orleans. So those are some places that, just off the top of my head, that people who aren't looking to to drop too much money but want to have really good food, and particularly with a group of people, that I would recommend. Do you want to go to the donor set?
Well, let's do two quick subsets. You mentioned, like, some people are going to come to New Orleans and be like, I want the best po' boy. I want so we talked a little bit about the best burger earlier. I'm partial to Port of Call. It's an old Joe Drape standby, that longtime New York Times horse racing writer.
Block away from Port of Call.
Oh, wow. Okay. It's lit pretty much exclusively by Christmas lights, which I find to be amazing. It has endearing dinginess. Would that be?
Absolutely. And Port of Call is great. And it's a great thick patty burger cooked on a on a grill. And to me, the two idiosyncrasies of it is that the cheese comes unmelted on top of it, and it comes with a baked potato and not French fries, which
a baked potato the size of your laugh.
Yeah, roughly. For po' boys, Liuzzas by the Track. That's the full name of it. There's another restaurant that's called just Liuzzas. I actually like them both quite well. I'm particularly fond of Liuzzas by the Track for its po' boys, but also its gumbo. This is basically a corner bar that has a menu, and big frosty, globes of tap beer, and just a fantastic seafood gumbo with sausage in it that's spicier on contact than most in town. Often gumbos get spicy when you put the hot sauce in them. And I think it's worth checking out for that, particularly for lunch. It closes a little earlier at dinner time. The other, going back uptown, Liuzzas by the Track is right by the racetrack where Jazz Fest happens, and where our buddy Jeff Duncan spends a lot of his salary. And
he would call it investing, by the way, not actually spending his salary. That pick five's coming home.
The back uptown, there's two old school New Orleans po' boy joints that I think everyone ought to know about. One is called Guy's Po' Boys, right on Magazine Street, pretty far uptown. The guy who runs that place has maybe made more po' boys by hand than anyone alive at this point. He's pushing that, Marvin. And Domalices is the embodiment of an old school New Orleans po' boy joint. It's also uptown, actually not that far from Guy's, a place you go to lunch. It's, there's sort of a bewildering system for how you order when you walk in. It's one of those places, but just go with it. You order your sandwich at one place and you got to get your root beer at the other one, and blah, blah, blah. But it's a great old New Orleans po' boy's place, particularly fried oyster there I would get, or shrimp. I love those two things there. I don't know, those are my favorites. Parkway Bakery is also a very good po' boy place and is open, stays open later, you know, if you just want to nosh at night.
If maybe you've had a beverage or two and need to fill your belly.
Or, you know, if you're in the French Quarter, there's Killer Po' Boys. One of their locations is located in the back of a bar. And they do these kind of modern po' boys. They got like you know, I mean, the menu changes somewhat, but they do a Vietnamese shrimp po' boy. They do a vegetarian one that's like actually really delicious, roasted sweet potatoes and like collard greens on it. It's great. And sometimes they'll do a meatloaf one that I think is, particularly if you've had a couple of drinks, is pretty great.
Well, let's go with the little white tablecloth set. Obviously, New Orleans has just fantastic high-end restaurants. I've always been a huge fan of like the Gulf oysters. I mean, those are just, I live in Boston, so they're just so different than the oysters I get there. And there's so many different places and kinds of things. I mean, we could do a podcast just on those. But what are if someone's going to make a reservation coming in from out of town, what are two or three great high-end places, Brett, that you'd recommend?
Well, speaking of oysters, there's a restaurant called Peche, P-E-C-H-E. It's run by the same group that run Cochon, which we mentioned earlier, and it is absolutely one of the best places to eat oysters here. There has been, even in the years since I lived in Pete's neighborhood back in 2012, 2013 on the East Coast. And even just since then, there has been this boom in new sort of cultivated Gulf oysters. And basically what that amounts to is that there's more choices. It used to be when you walked into a New Orleans oyster bar, it's just like, give me oysters, and you just got what they had, right? There wasn't like, oh, I need the, you know, the Blue Points, the Pick-a-Cheek Bay, or the Sandy Daddy, like whatever's, right? That's starting to change, and I think it's for the better. I mean, you do get to kind of choose a little bit more the style that you might want, and Peche is really at the forefront of showcasing a lot of these oysters coming out of Alabama and Louisiana and Mississippi, and it also is a fantastic seafood restaurant.
Let me just ask, like, for our listeners who are not oyster savvy, like, what's the difference between a Gulf oyster and maybe like a traditional oyster you'd get in Boston?
Well, they're technically the same species, but the way that the Gulf of Mexico is warmer waters, and it generally yields a larger oyster. It depends on the time of year you're harvesting them, right? Like November is, as far as I'm concerned, absolutely one of the best times to eat oysters in Louisiana. It's a little bit more of a moderate size oyster. It's going to have a little bit more salinity than it would in the middle of the summer, and they're also. Whereas, this is broadly speaking, we're painting with broad brushes. On the East Coast and the West Coast, the oysters do tend a little smaller. They tend to be brinier. They have like a little bit more minerality to them. And Louisiana oysters tend to be just more mild. These cultivated oysters I talked about just a little bit ago, they tend to have a little bit more similar characteristics to the ones that you find in New England. The other big difference is that because of the kind of water content and the size of Gulf oysters is that they're ideal for cooking. They're wonderful for frying. It's why you see it so much in the cookery. In other places in America where oysters are plentiful, you do not see oysters in the cooked food the way you do in New Orleans. They're great for poaching in gumbos or just in cream. And famously Galatoire's restaurants. We're talking about the oldest school of the white tablecloth restaurants, really. I mean, one of them in America. Its menu has not changed much in 13 years or something it's been open. They do bacon-wrapped fried oysters. Served in a butter sauce.
I'm drooling.
So that's like, but it's delicious. I mentioned Galahad, so we should finish the thought on it. If you do go, I really recommend sitting downstairs, which is the old dining room. It's boisterous. You have to wear a coat if you're a guy. They have a dress code, but it's a very riotous experience eating there. I block out a lot of time, get a Sazerac, course the meal out, get some pompano, get the catch of the day kind of thing, and just enjoy yourself. There'll probably be 4 to 10 different singings of Happy Birthday. I mean, it's weird when you're in there. But if it's right on Bourbon Street, but Galatoire's was there before Bourbon Street is what it is today, you know, and it's it's the embodiment of a only in New Orleans experience, fine dining experience. Clancys is considered the sort of uptown version of Galatoire's. It's a little more user friendly. Like you can get a reservation, for instance. You
can probably see the sports columnist for the Times-Picayune sitting at the bar too.
Yes, the aforementioned Jeff Duncan, and spending his winnings from the track. But it's a great old French Creole menu, and waiters dressed in tuxedos, good French wine list, and I think also excellent seafood in particular. They've got a cold smoked fried soft shell crab that is to die for, and a great veal chop. It's very unpretentious old New Orleans cooking done very well in a building that used to be a po' boy shop that's in the residential uptown neighborhood.
Is there maybe one more spot? I think we went through Galatoire's, we went through Kant Clancys. Is there maybe one more that just might not be like those are? I think of those as like the oldest guard of New Orleans. Maybe one other alternative for our listeners.
Yeah, the places I just mentioned because it sort of felt natural are very old school New Orleans restaurants. I mean, these are the last one I'd thrown in that tradition is Brightson's, which is more of a homey kind of New Orleans restaurant, where these other ones are a little more buttoned up that I'd mentioned, but is Frank Brightson's a James Beard Award winner, and him and his wife Marna have a great place in a old converted cottage uptown, and has fantastic old New Orleans, sort of a mixture of Creole and Cajun cooking. On the modern end of things, I mean, Pesh, which I mentioned first, is very much a modern New Orleans seafood restaurant that has great local fish, whole roasted red fish and snappers, things like this. The Compère Le Pen I had mentioned earlier, just to bring it up again, Nina Compton's restaurant, she's the woman who's from St. Lucia, I just think one of the better, the kitchen's just really on point right now. I've eaten there a couple of times since the summer. I'm also very fond of a restaurant called Coquette, which is, and this is again, chefs Michael Stolfutz and Kristen Essig are their partners in work and life, and they're both chefs, and it's one, I think it's probably the most successfully sort of creative cooking in New Orleans, meaning it's very ambitious, but they a lot of really ambitious ideas that chefs have don't always translate that well to the plate. That's Coquette it does, and it's located in an old brick New Orleans uptown building on Washington Street, which has all the beautiful trees and stuff on it. It's a very picturesque and wonderful place for dinner, particularly if you want to eat some kind of more creative cooking.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here today, Brett. I appreciate you. I appreciate you taking some time this morning here at Hotel Peter and Paul to walk us through this wonderful city and all its dining options. Best of luck to your Gophers as it comes. And why don't we finish by you giving our listeners a sense of, if they want to do a little more research. I know obviously you write lists every year of best restaurants, and there's dining guides, and there's different things, and I'll certainly tweet them out if you follow me on Twitter at Pete Thamel. I'll give a sense of just some guidelines almost that Brett does annually. But do you want to give people a sense of where they could go on NOLA.com to find some New Orleans staples?
Yeah, if you go to NOLA.com, there's a tab for Where New Orleans Eats. That's all our food coverage. It's a great place to go. There's also a Facebook page you can go to for that's Where New Orleans Eats, and Instagram. I am on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @BrettEats, and I will make a point to tweet out some links that has information about the restaurants that we just discussed and some others in the week and before this podcast goes live. But I'll put out the top 10 restaurants and best new restaurants and some other things that people can look at. I should say that both those pages feature the work of my colleagues Ann Maloney and Tadia Price, who are both excellent and very well-informed food journalists as well. And I don't know. I think that should do it.
All right. Go to NOLA.com. Go to @BrettEats and
Go Gophers.
Go Gophers, row the boat, eat and drink your hearts out, LSU, Alabama, and SEC fans. This is Pete Thamel for the Yahoo College Sports Podcast, signing off.